What happens when a friendly morning show interview turns into one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history? Today we're breaking down the explosive exchange that led Gwen Stefani to walk off the Today with Jenna and Friends set. And trust me, you need to hear every word of what was said. Make sure you subscribe and drop a comment telling me whose side you're on after you hear this whole story, because this one is wild. The interview started off exactly how you'd expect. Gwen Stefani walked onto the set with her signature confidence, settling into the couch across from Jenna Hager, and the guest co-hosts for the day. The energy seemed light, friendly even. Jenna opened with the standard welcome, talking about how excited they were to have Gwen on the show, mentioning her latest music project and her upcoming performances. Gwen smiled, thanked them for having her, and everything seemed perfectly normal. But within minutes, the tone began to shift in a way that nobody in that studio could have predicted. Jenna started with what seemed like an innocent enough question. She brought up Gwen's career, longevity, praising how she'd managed to stay relevant across different decades and different music styles. Gwen nodded along, clearly comfortable with this line of conversation. She talked about her evolution as an artist, how she'd grown from her No Doubt days into her solo career, and how important it was for her to keep challenging herself creatively. The co-hosts chimed in with agreement, and for a moment, it looked like this was going to be just another pleasant celebrity interview. Then Jenna pivoted. She mentioned how Gwen had recently spoken about authenticity in the music industry and how important it was to stay true to yourself. Gwen's face lit up at this, clearly passionate about the topic. She started talking about how she'd always tried to be genuine in her music, how she'd never wanted to be something she wasn't just to sell records or chase trends. She talked about the pressure artists face to constantly reinvent themselves, to stay in the headlines, to remain relevant at any cost. That's when one of the guest co-hosts jumped in. She brought up some of the criticism Gwen had faced over the years about cultural appropriation, specifically referencing her use of Japanese fashion and imagery during certain periods of her career. The room temperature seemed to drop about 10 degrees. You could see Gwen's expression change immediately. Her smile didn't exactly disappear, but it became fixed, almost frozen. Jenna looked slightly uncomfortable, like maybe this wasn't the direction she'd planned for the conversation to go, but she didn't intervene. Gwen took a breath before responding. She said that she'd always had deep respect and love for Japanese culture, that her inspiration came from a place of genuine admiration. She explained that it was never her intention to appropriate or disrespect anyone, that she'd always tried to celebrate the things she loved. Her tone was measured, diplomatic, clearly something she'd thought about and addressed before. But the guest co-host wasn't satisfied with that answer. She pressed further, saying that intention doesn't always equal impact, that there were people who felt hurt or misrepresented by some of Gwen's choices. She asked if Gwen had ever truly listened to those criticisms or if she'd just dismissed them. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jenna shifted in her seat, glancing between Gwen and her co-host. Gwen's jaw tightened just slightly. She said that of course she'd listened, that she'd spent years thinking about these issues, learning and growing. She mentioned that it was frustrating to have her genuine love and appreciation for a culture reduced to something malicious or exploitative. Her voice had an edge to it now, not quite angry, but definitely defensive. She said that she'd never claimed to be something she wasn't, and that the whole conversation around cultural exchange had become so complicated that it sometimes felt like you couldn't appreciate anything outside your own background without being attacked. The other co-host on the panel decided to weigh in at this point, trying to smooth things over. She said something about how these conversations were important but also difficult, how there was probably truth on both sides. Gwen nodded, seeming to appreciate the attempt at balance. But the guest co-host, who'd started this line of questioning, wasn't backing down. She said that it wasn't about attacking anyone, it was about accountability, about recognizing when you've benefited from something that wasn't yours to take. That word, take, seemed to really strike a nerve with Gwen. She sat up straighter, her hands gesturing more emphatically now. She said she hadn't taken anything from anyone, that cultural exchange was different from cultural theft, and that accusing her of stealing from Japanese culture was both inaccurate and deeply unfair. She pointed out that she'd been transparent about her influences from the beginning, that she'd never hidden where her inspiration came from. Jenna finally tried to step in, suggesting they could move on to talk about Gwen's new music, but the guest co-host cut her off. She said they couldn't just skip past important issues because they made people uncomfortable, that this was exactly the kind of conversation that needed to happen on mainstream platforms. Gwen let out a laugh, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes right before someone says something they've been holding back. She said that this wasn't a conversation, it was an ambush, that she'd come on the show to talk about her music and her life, not to be put on trial for decade-old choices that she'd already addressed multiple times. The tension was now impossible to ignore. The other co-host tried again to mediate, saying that maybe everyone just needed to take a breath and reset. Gwen shook her head, saying she didn't need to reset, she needed to be heard. She said that she'd spent her entire career being authentic, being vulnerable, sharing her real experiences and emotions with the world. And that having all of that dismissed as problematic was exhausting. Her voice was rising now, not shouting but definitely louder, more passionate. The guest co-host responded that nobody was dismissing her career, but that success didn't make someone immune from criticism. She said that Gwen had a platform and a responsibility that came with that platform. Gwen shot back that she knew about her platform, that she'd used it to support countless causes and communities, and that being lectured about responsibility by someone who didn't know her or understand her work was incredibly condescending. Jenna made another attempt to take control of the interview, her voice firmer this time. She said that clearly this was a topic with a lot of strong feelings on all sides, and maybe they needed to acknowledge that and move forward. But you could see that the damage was already done. Gwen was shaking her head, her lips pressed together in a tight line. That's when the conversation took an even sharper turn. The guest co-host brought up Gwen's recent comments about identity and how people define themselves. She asked Gwen point blank if she still stood by some of her previous statements that had been controversial. Gwen's eyes widened, and she asked what specific statements the co-host was referring to. The co-host referenced an interview where Gwen had discussed culture and background in a way that some people found problematic. Gwen's face flushed, and she said that her words had been taken out of context, twisted to mean something she'd never intended. The back and forth was getting faster now, more heated. Voices were overlapping. Jenna kept trying to moderate, but she was clearly losing control of the situation. The guest co-host accused Gwen of playing the victim instead of taking responsibility. Gwen fired back that taking responsibility was different from accepting false narratives about who she was and what she stood for. She said that she'd been in the public eye for over 2 decades, that she'd made mistakes and learned from them, but that didn't give anyone the right to rewrite her story or her intentions. Another co-host chimed in, trying to ask Gwen about her perspective on how public figures should handle criticism. But Gwen was done being diplomatic. She said that there was criticism, and then there was character assassination, and that this interview had crossed a line. She said she'd come on the show in good faith, expecting to have a genuine conversation, not to be interrogated and judged by people who'd already made up their minds about her before she even sat down. The guest co-host responded that asking difficult questions wasn't an interrogation, it was journalism. That comment seemed to push Gwen over the edge. Her voice was sharp now, cutting. She said that journalism required fairness and context, not gotcha questions designed to make someone look bad. The energy in the studio was suffocating at this point. The audience was completely silent, and you could sense that everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Gwen leaned forward, her entire posture radiating frustration. She said that she'd been patient, she'd been respectful, she'd answered every question thrown at her, but this had gone beyond an interview. She told the guest co-host directly that there was a difference between asking tough questions and creating a hostile environment, and that what was happening right now felt a lot more like the latter. The guest co-host opened her mouth to respond, but Gwen held up her hand, making it clear she wasn't finished. She said that if this was really about having an honest conversation, then everyone needed to be honest. She asked the guest co-host point blank if she'd come into this interview already believing Gwen was guilty of appropriation, already convinced that she hadn't done enough to address it. The co-host hesitated for just a moment, and in that pause, you could see Gwen's expression harden. She said that silence was telling, that it proved this had never been about dialogue, it had been about judgment. Jenna jumped in quickly, trying to diffuse what was becoming an increasingly personal confrontation. She said that everyone on the panel respected Gwen and her work, that these were just important cultural conversations that needed to happen. But Gwen cut her off this time, her voice sharp. She said respect wasn't just a word you throw around. It was something you showed through your actions. And ambushing someone on live television didn't feel very respectful. The guest co-host fired back that public figures don't get to control the narrative. That part of being in the spotlight means being ready to answer difficult questions at any time. Gwen laughed again, that same bitter laugh from before. She said that was a convenient excuse for ambush journalism, that hiding behind the idea of accountability was just a way to justify making people uncomfortable for entertainment value. She asked if this was really about social justice or if it was about creating a viral moment, getting clicks and views by watching someone squirm. That accusation seemed to catch the guest co-host off guard. She insisted that this wasn't about entertainment. It was about using the platform responsibly to address real issues that real people cared about. Gwen shook her head, saying that if she really cared about those issues, she'd approach them with more nuance and less aggression. She said that attacking someone publicly wasn't activism, it was performative. The other co-host tried once more to mediate, suggesting that maybe both sides had valid points, that maybe this was just a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. Gwen turned to look at her directly and said that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a fundamental difference in how people approached difficult conversations. She said that she believed in growth and learning, but that she also believed in grace, and giving people the benefit of the doubt. In recognizing that nobody's perfect, the guest co-host interjected, saying that grace was important, but so was accountability, and that sometimes holding people accountable felt uncomfortable but was necessary. Gwen's eyes flashed, and she said she was so tired of that word, accountability, being used as a weapon to beat people down instead of lift conversations up. She said that real accountability involved dialogue, involved listening to all sides, involved recognizing complexity. Jenna was visibly struggling now. She tried to lighten the mood, making a comment about how passionate everyone was about these topics, but nobody was laughing. The tension was too thick. Gwen gave Jenna a look that wasn't quite angry, but definitely disappointed, like she'd expected her to take control of the situation. The guest co-host wasn't letting up. She brought up specific instances from Gwen's past, specific music videos and performances that had drawn criticism. She asked Gwen to address each one, to explain her thinking at the time. Gwen's hands were clenched now, her knuckles white. She said that she wasn't going to sit here and relitigate every creative choice she'd ever made, that her work spoke for itself. The co-host pressed harder, saying that was a deflection, that Gwen was avoiding the specific questions. Gwen's voice rose, not to a shout but definitely louder, more forceful. She said she wasn't deflecting, she was refusing to participate in a trap, in a conversation designed to make her fail, no matter what she said. She explained that if she defended herself, she'd be called defensive. If she apologized, it would never be enough. And if she tried to explain the context, she'd be accused of making excuses. Another co-host, who'd been mostly quiet until now, spoke up. She asked Gwen what she wanted from this conversation, what outcome would satisfy her. Gwen paused, seeming to consider the question seriously. She said that what she wanted was to be heard, to be understood, to be treated like a human being who's done her best, even when she's fallen short. She said that she'd never claimed to be perfect, but that she deserved the same empathy she'd tried to extend to others throughout her career. The guest co-host responded that empathy couldn't come at the expense of truth. Gwen snapped back that she'd been telling her truth this entire interview, but that her truth wasn't being accepted because it didn't fit the narrative that had already been decided. She said that people had already made up their minds and were just looking for evidence to confirm what they already believed. Jenna tried another angle, asking Gwen about her music, about what inspired her latest work, but Gwen wasn't interested in pivoting anymore. She said that she appreciated Jenna trying to move things along, but that you couldn't just jump from a character assassination to talking about her album like nothing had happened. She said that the damage had been done, that her appearance on the show had been turned into something she never agreed to. The guest co-host said that calling it character assassination was dramatic, that they'd simply asked her to address legitimate criticisms. Gwen's laugh was harsh this time, humorless. She said that framing and intent mattered, that the way questions were asked revealed the asker's true motivations, and that it was clear from the beginning where this was headed. The tension reached a new peak when the guest co-host said that maybe if Gwen had addressed these issues more directly years ago, they wouldn't be having this conversation now. Gwen stood up slightly from her seat, then sat back down, clearly trying to control her emotions. She said that she had addressed these issues multiple times, in multiple forums, but that people only seemed to remember the sound bites that fit their narrative. Another co-host asked if Gwen could understand why some people felt hurt by her past actions, even if that wasn't her intention. Gwen said, of course, she could understand that, but that understanding someone's feelings didn't mean accepting their interpretation of her intentions as fact. She said that she'd had countless conversations with people from the communities in question, that she'd listened and learned, but that those conversations were private and respectful. Unlike this public interrogation, the guest co-host said that public figures needed to have these conversations publicly. Gwen responded that there was a difference between sharing your growth journey and being forced to perform contrition on demand. She said that real change happened through genuine reflection, not through public spectacle. Jenna made one last attempt to salvage the interview. She brought up Gwen's family, asking if they'd been supportive during difficult times. But this seemed to be the final straw for Gwen. Her expression shifted from frustrated to genuinely angry. She said that her family was off limits, that dragging her personal life into this mess was crossing a line she wouldn't tolerate. She said that this interview had gone from uncomfortable to unacceptable, and that she wasn't going to sit here and be used as content for a show that clearly had no respect for her boundaries. The studio fell into an even deeper silence. Jenna's face went pale, and she immediately tried to walk back the family question, saying she didn't mean anything by it, that it was just a general question about support systems. But Gwen was shaking her head before Jenna even finished speaking. She said that everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes proved that this wasn't a safe space for her to share anything personal, that bringing up her family after everything else was either incredibly tone-deaf or deliberately manipulative. She asked Jenna directly if she thought that, after being attacked for the past segment, Gwen would suddenly open up about her private life just because they asked nicely. Jenna looked genuinely distressed now, insisting that nobody was attacking Gwen. that they were just trying to have important conversations. Gwen cut her off mid-sentence, her voice firm and final. She said that she'd heard that excuse repeatedly throughout this interview, and it was wearing thin. She pointed out that important conversations required mutual respect, required both parties to come in good faith, and that she no longer believed that was what was happening here. The guest co-host, seeming to sense that things were reaching a breaking point, tried a different approach. She said that she appreciated Gwen's perspective, that she could see how this might have felt confrontational, and that maybe they could start fresh with a different topic. But Gwen wasn't buying it. She said that you can't unring a bell, that the damage was done, and that trying to pretend the last 20 minutes hadn't happened was insulting to everyone's intelligence. She looked directly into the camera, addressing the audience for the first time. She said that she wanted everyone watching to understand that she'd come here with open arms, ready to share her music and her story, but that what happened instead was a setup. She said that this was what was wrong with media today, that clicks and controversy mattered more than truth and respect, and that she refused to participate in it any longer. Jenna was scrambling now, clearly panicking. She said that Gwen was an important voice, that they valued her presence on the show, and that they wanted to make this right. She asked what they could do to fix this, to salvage the conversation. Gwen let out a long breath, and for a moment it seemed like she might consider it. But then she shook her head slowly. She said that the problem wasn't fixable with words. At this point, that actions had consequences, and that the action of turning her interview into an interrogation had the consequence of her not wanting to be there anymore. She said she'd spent decades in the entertainment industry dealing with difficult questions and challenging situations, but that she'd always maintained her dignity and her boundaries, and today those boundaries had been crossed. The guest co-host made one final attempt to keep Gwen in her seat. She said that walking away would just fuel the narrative that Gwen couldn't handle criticism, that she was running from accountability. That comment seemed to crystallize something in Gwen's expression. She stood up from the couch, her microphone still attached. She said that she wasn't running from anything, that she'd faced every question head-on, answered every accusation, defended herself against every insinuation, and that choosing to remove herself from a toxic situation wasn't weakness, it was self-respect. She reached down and unclipped her microphone, the sound of it detaching, echoing through the silent studio. She told Jenna that she was disappointed, that she'd expected better from this show, from this network. Jenna started to respond, her voice cracking slightly, but Gwen held up her hand one more time. She said she wasn't interested in apologies or excuses, that what was done, and that she had better things to do with her time than sit here and be disrespected. She looked at the guest co-host who'd started this whole confrontation and said that she hoped the viral moment was worth it, that she hoped the clicks and the attention brought whatever satisfaction was being sought, because the cost was trust and credibility. One of the other co-hosts weakly suggested that maybe everyone should take a break, that they could come back and approach this differently. But Gwen was already moving toward the edge of the set. She said that there wouldn't be a coming back, that this interview was over, and that she wouldn't be returning to finish it. Jenna stood up as well, following Gwen a few steps, pleading with her to reconsider. She said that they could edit the segment, that they could have a conversation off camera about what went wrong. Gwen stopped and turned back, and you could see the exhaustion on her face. She told Jenna that editing wouldn't change what happened, that a private conversation wouldn't undo the public humiliation, and that ending things like this was exactly what needed to happen. The guest co-host spoke up again, her voice defensive. She said that if Gwen couldn't handle difficult conversations about her past, maybe that said more about her than it did about the questions being asked. Gwen paused in her exit, and for a second it looked like she might turn around and engage again. But instead, she just shook her head and kept walking. As she moved off the set, you could hear Jenna trying to address the camera, trying to salvage what was left of the segment. She was stumbling over her words, saying something about how these conversations were important, but clearly today wasn't the right time or place. The other co-hosts were exchanging glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The guest co-host looked defensive, but also slightly uncomfortable, perhaps realizing that things had gone too far. Gwen disappeared behind the studio wall, and you could see staff members rushing around. Jenna was still trying to talk to the camera, but her usual composure was completely shattered. She said they'd take a commercial break, but her voice was shaking. The cameras kept rolling for a few extra seconds, capturing the chaos on the set, the whispered conversations between the co-hosts, the visible tension that now filled the space where moments before Gwen had been sitting. What made this whole situation so explosive wasn't just that Gwen walked off, it was how she walked off. She didn't storm out in anger, didn't throw anything or yell. She made a calculated decision to remove herself from a situation that had become untenable, and she did it with a clarity and purpose that made it clear this wasn't an emotional outburst but a boundary being enforced. The fallout from this interview was immediate and intense. Social media erupted with opinions from all sides. Some people defended Gwen, saying she was ambushed and had every right to leave. Others supported the co-hosts, arguing that public figures need to be held accountable. But regardless of where people fell on the issue, everyone agreed that this was one of the most dramatic and uncomfortable celebrity interviews in recent memory. What this interview exposed was a fundamental tension in how we conduct conversations about difficult topics in the media. The question at the heart of all this remains, when someone feels ambushed in an interview, are they running from accountability or standing up for themselves? When interviewers push hard on controversial topics, are they doing important work or creating conflict for content? What's undeniable is that this interview will be remembered as a moment when the tension between celebrity, media, and accountability reached a breaking point on live television. Whether you think Gwen was right to walk off or should have stayed and continued the conversation, there's no question that this was a defining moment. So what do you think? Was Gwen justified in walking off the Today with Jenna and Friends show? Or should she have stayed and finished the interview? Make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I want to hear where you stand on this whole situation.